Alexander, let's talk about what's going on in Saudi Arabia and with oil. I mean,
Mhm.
I'm watching the oil prices. They're kind of just they're like the 24, 27 mark, just bouncing up and down. I haven't
Absolutely.
seen huge fluctuations.
No.
But you sent me an article today as well that Saudi Arabia is burning through their reserves. What's going on there?
Yes, I mean this is the point because, of course, as you may remember from our recent videos, as I'm sure our viewers remember, MBS launched in March this crazy price war, in which brought the oil price crashing and caused a crash, by the way, in across world stock markets also, and it was all about trying to establish himself and Saudi Arabia as the great pivotal state in the oil market, and he was going to be the king of oil again, and smash shale oil, the shale oil people in the US, and put the Russians in their place. And of course, he infuriated Donald Trump. He antagonized Vladimir Putin. He had a massive row, as we now know, over the phone with Vladimir Putin. And now we're starting to see the effects not generally in terms of what's happened to the US, where the US has got a huge, massive, diversified economy. Things can go wrong in the oil markets and in the oil industries, but the US carries on because it can absorb it. And we see with Russia, they're not as big an economy, obviously, as the US. They're not as diversified, obviously, as the US, but they run a very careful fiscal policies. They have large reserves. They're doing okay. The Saudis, however, are burning through their reserves at an absolutely astronomical rate. And the last I heard is that perhaps they have about a year at the rate they're burning up their money. So already MBS is being forced into making cutbacks. He's apparently cutting back on his weapons purchases, which is a very difficult thing for him to do. He's now starting to cut back on social spending within Saudi Arabia, which I suspect is going to be an extremely difficult decision for the Saudis to pull off, because within Saudi Arabia, the way they basically gain allegiance, is by buying allegiance, by giving out large amounts of money to people to keep them sweet and happy. The point is, you're perfectly correct. Oil has rebounded on the back of the OPEC plus deal that Donald Trump basically brokered or twisted MBS's arm into accepting. It's now trading, as you roughly said, if you're talking about a WTI crude, it's between about 20, 24, 27. It's that sort of range. It goes up and down a bit, but it's about that range. And I suspect, by the way, it's going to stay there until the economies start to reopen. That's far too low for Saudi Arabia. They needed, before they started the price war, oil at about $81 a barrel to balance their budget. The Russians needed $43 to balance their budget. But the Russians, as I said, have huge reserves and a much bigger and much more diversified economy. And the other great advantage the Russians have is they don't have a fixed exchange rate. Their currency floats, and so they don't have to burn through foreign currency reserves to keep it stable. And here's the wonder of the thing, because just as Saudi Arabia is burning through its reserves at a rate of about $30 billion a month, which is a lot for a country when its reserves started at about $400 billion, is going through its reserves, at a speed 10% a month. It can't sustain this for much longer, because if reserves fall below a certain level, then foreign currency traders begin to start getting worried, and they start pulling out of the Saudi currency, and they start betting against it. They see the foreign currency reserves falling, whereas Russian foreign currency reserves, and this maybe we shall discuss in another program. The amazing thing is, since March, they've actually grown. They were 500. They fell from $580 billion to $550 billion, and they've now gone back up to $567 billion. They've actually jumped up again. And the reason is that because people see a financially stable situation in Russia, money is going back in there. And the ruble has been steady, and so has inflation. So it's a completely different situation. MBS miscalculated big time. And on top of everything else, there's now reports that Donald Trump, just as we predicted, is starting to take troops out of Saudi Arabia. He's withdrawn Patriot missile batteries that he sent there. He's withdrawn troops that he sent there. He's no longer prepared to give MBS the benefit of the doubt, the carte blanche that he was doing just a few weeks ago. So MBS has screwed up big time. Saudi Arabia is now facing a crisis, the like of which it has never experienced since the end of the Second World War, and its greatest friends, the Americans, have been made very angry.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because that would explain why Saudi Arabia, I believe they unilaterally cut back production as well, didn't they?
Yeah, that's right. I forgot to mention that, but you're absolutely right to say it. They've unilaterally cut production by a further 1 million barrels, because they're desperately trying to stabilize. They're panicking. They're desperately trying to stabilize the oil market. And I wonder how long the princes will put up with more of this from MBS, actually. And,
he's toast.
They could, well, I think so. I mean, they're a pretty ruthless bunch. If they feel that the kingdom is tottering because of his misjudgments, I mean, they've done it before. They may very well tell him, or they may come to the king and tell him, look, MBS has got to go. If he doesn't go, you go.
Yeah, they're going to have to. There's no choice here. But it's really interesting to wrap it up on this one topic before we move over to, I want to discuss the war between Germany and the EU, which is an interesting topic. But before we get there, it's really interesting that you said that money has moved into Russia, and is moving out of places like Saudi Arabia. I think, to me, that signals that the downturn, though, you can say it's caused by, obviously it's caused by the lockdown and by the CV. It's the investment dollars, the cash, doesn't seem to be afraid of the pandemic so much. And I say that because Russia is experiencing around 10 to 11,000 new infections every day. It's surging in infections, but the money is going in there. And I think that's because the economy is still operating on a pretty significant level in Russia. And the investment dollars don't seem to be panicking at the pandemic panic. They're not panicking. Pandemic panic,
Just to say one thing about infections. I mean, the reason we see these high rates of infection is important to understand. About 2/3 of them are in one location, which is Moscow. Moscow is in very tight lockdown. The rest of Russia isn't. There are far fewer rates of infection there, and most of the economy, this isn't something widely understood, is still functioning. And in fact, a few decisions were made, which are opening more of the economy now, so that it's working better. Also, I mean, they've managed, I think, their budgeting very, very carefully, not just over the long term, but over the last few weeks during the lockdowns too. So they run a much tighter ship than I think most people understand. And it's still surprising. It surprises me that there should be money flows into Russia. I mean, it's something it's not happened before during a time of world crisis. Usually, whenever there's a world economic crisis, as there was in '98, as there was in 2008, money leaves Russia in vast quantities, ruble crashes, interest rates rise, inflation rises. It shows how the hard work, in a way, that the Russians have been doing to sort out the problems in the economy, their economy, over the last 12 years have borne fruit, so that the currency's been remarkably stable, all things considered. I mean, it's fallen back, but nothing like the extent to which it's fallen back in other crises, and it's now pretty stable. The budget seems to be under reasonable control. And of course, instead of inflation taking off, it's still very much within single figures and probably will start falling again in a few weeks. And money, instead of going out, is coming in. So it's unusual. We still haven't got the whole story about this. And there's a lot to discuss and unpack and to explain about how exactly it's happened. But whatever it is, Russia economically is getting by. Saudi Arabia is not getting by at all. They have seriously misjudged the whole situation. They made a lot of enemies, and frankly, they now find themselves in a very bad way and very short of friends.
Yeah, but just to clarify on Moscow, I mean, there has been a lockdown.
Yeah, pretty tough. Pretty tough.
I think you can say it's tough in certain areas, but in other areas,
no, exactly.
It's not as tough. It's more,
yeah.
They let people go about their normal business instead of like going to the office, riding public transport.
Yes.
They do give people that kind of leeway to do very normal things. And I think that helps in that it doesn't create a wide panic among the citizens. And when you follow the money, the money will come into Russia, because there isn't that sense of panic.
No, I mean,
overall, you may have in other countries.
Well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's certainly true. I mean, as I said, most of the restrictions you hear about are in Moscow, which is, as I said, the epicenter of the epidemic there. The further away you go from Moscow, the less they are. I mean, I have an acquaintance who's in Crimea at the moment. And he says, there's no lockdown there. I mean, there's social distancing. There's very, very heavy testing. Russia is huge on tests. They're now actually overtaken the US in the number of tests they do, which is, and the US dwarfs everyone else. So these are the two countries, the US and Russia, that dwarf everyone else on tests. So they're very heavy on tests. But the tough lockdown is in Moscow, not everywhere else. And that's something I think people don't really understand.
And even even in the tough lockdown in Moscow, it's not
it's
a blanket lockdown on everybody.
No, it's not a blanket It's not a blanket lockdown. And I mean, the other thing is that they a lot of the industrial facilities, for example, in Moscow are still open and are running, and they have checks, they do all kinds of things with people, they have sanitary controls and things, but a lot of the economy is generally working.
That's what I wanted to say. They didn't turn off the lights.
No, they didn't turn off. They didn't turn off.
Not even close.
They didn't turn off. No, they didn't come close to doing anything like that. And as I said, they ran a tight ship. Saudi Arabia didn't run a tight ship. What they're doing with the CV crisis in Saudi Arabia, I've lost track of, to be honest. Probably nothing very much, knowing MBS. But the fact is, with oil, he miscalculated very badly, and he's in a bad mess. And as I said, I think the Americans won't forget this, both Democrats and Republicans.
As they shouldn't. Okay, Alexander, let's get to Europe, the EU, and Germany, because it seems like we're having a civil war here. And let me just read you the title from Zero Hedge on this. You can comment. Europe in crisis. German judges strike back, say ECB isn't, and I quote, isn't master of the universe. Alexander, civil war. Who's the bigger dog, the ECB and the European Union, or Germany?
Well, quite so. And I mean, this is actually very interesting, because, of course, the European Court of Justice, in legal terms, has always considered itself to be, if not the master of the universe, certainly the master of Europe. I mean, they've never hesitated to say, when national laws are wrong, and to strike them down and to impose European law on everybody and everything. And they've been incredibly aggressive. They've now come up against the one court in Europe that can stand up to them, which is the German Constitutional Court. And what is incredibly interesting about this story is that the Germans, because the European Court of Justice huffed and puffed and said, you can't possibly do this. We are the only people. We are the people who interpret the law. The European Commission has said, we're going to bring an infringement claim against Germany because, this is an outrageous decision. So they've huffed and puffed, and the Germans have basically stuck up two fingers at them. That's what the German Constitutional Court is now doing. They're saying, look, you can say what you like. This is the decision we've made. You are wrong. We are right. We don't pay any attention to what you're saying. Now, they've never experienced that. The European Court of Justice has never in its life history experienced anything quite like this. There's never been a situation, to my knowledge, where any European national court has openly defied one of its rulings. And that must be causing them absolute anguish, because remember, that is the basis of their power, and ultimately it's the basis of the entire EU. The whole EU ultimately works on the bluff, if you will, because in terms of Germany it is a bluff. The decisions of the European Court of Justice are binding and final and cannot be set aside or appealed.
It's like the manager of a football club has a problem with the star player, and the star player says, you know what? F you. I'm going to do my own thing. If that star player leaves, the football team collapses. That star player is Germany.
That is, if I may say so, a perfect analogy. That gets it exactly right. That gets it exactly right. I mean, if the European, the Constitutional Court of France or Italy were to say something like this, well, the European Court of Justice, if it had Germany behind it, would steamroll all over them. But when it's the Germans, it's a completely different story.
They're going to take their ball and go home, and that's it. The game is over.
I have to say, it's taken a while. It surprised me, actually, how much time it took. It took a while for the media to start to grasp the sheer enormity of this. But I think the penny's now dropped. And as I said, there's been all sorts of articles in the Financial Times here, for example, in Britain, which is fervently pro-EU and arch Remain newspaper, but is clearly rattled by this decision. And it's now being picked up by the media in the US. In Germany, it's big news, obviously. And the important thing is the Germans are not backing down. And German opinion backs its court against the European Court of Justice. So I think the battle lines are drawn, but this is a battle the European Court of Justice, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission can't win.
Boy, it really puts Merkel and van der Leyen in a bind, doesn't it?
Well, it does. It puts Merkel in an extraordinary bind. I mean, I have to say, if I can just talk about Merkel a moment, she's been coming up with some very bizarre statements about the Russians hacking her computers, which is weird. Now, I have to say, when I first saw that, it did cross my mind that this is all Russiagate related, and she's riding to Obama's rescue. We know how Merkel and Obama are, soul mates, basically. And so, Obama's in some trouble. We've talked about it a lot in our videos over Russiagate. So Merkel says, well, the Russians do these terrible things. They're doing it to me too. So that proves that Obama is right. But I can't help but think also that one of the reasons that Merkel does this is to distract attention from the fact that she has a European crisis coming, which she simply has no tools to solve. She can't. She doesn't have the power to reverse decisions of the German Constitutional Court. That just isn't an option for her. So what does she do in this situation? Well, what do European leaders, or at least neoliberal leaders in the West, do whenever they're under pressure or in trouble? they blame Moscow. It's the hand of Moscow is somehow involved. She can't say the judges in the Constitutional Court are Russian puppets, because, I mean, the German people would just laugh if they heard that. So, of course, she comes up with this bizarre story that, 5 years ago, the Russians hacked her computer and they're doing it still. So, I mean, this suggests to me that, as I said, she feels very much that this thing is now slipping out of her control.
All right. Great. Interesting news topics.
Very interesting.
All right, Alexander.
Watch Riyadh and watch Berlin. I think these are two very important places to look at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Good call. All right, let's move on, Alexander.